You can start now.
Welcome to this new episode of the WTO Trade Dialogues on Food, entitled High-Tech Foods and WTO Rules. Welcome to our panelists and welcome to our viewers. My name is Doa Abdelmutal. I'm Senior Counselor in the WTO Agriculture and Commodities Division, and I'll be moderating today's debate. I'll be putting 2 rounds of questions to our panelists, after which I'll be opening the floor to questions from you, the viewers. Please send your questions to dialogues@wto.org. I'd like to begin by providing some context for today's webinar. The World Trade Organization was created in 1996 as an international organization that would administer the rules of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, as well as all of the expanded accords of the Uruguay Round. One of the most important contributions of the Uruguay Round that established the WTO was its creation of an agreement on agriculture, so an agreement specific to agricultural trade. Which covers, of course, food as well as other agricultural commodities, all other agricultural commodities. The Uruguay Round also created the General Agreement on Trade and Services, as well as an agreement on the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. The Agreement on Agriculture has been extremely successful. Since its entry into force, global trade in agricultural products has more than tripled. It's now reached over $1.8 trillion US. The more fair and equitable rules created by the agreement have also given the developing world greater opportunities to trade. It's easy to forget, of course, what world agricultural markets looked like before the entry into force of the Agreement on Agriculture. Trade barriers came in all sorts of shapes and forms and lacked transparency. Developed world trade-distorting agricultural subsidies were also crowding out developing world exports. And basically, the law of the jungle prevailed. So we have come a long way. We in the WTO recognize that, of course, there's a lot more to do to liberalize trade in food and agricultural products, and that there is still a very serious gap between where industrial products are and where agricultural products are in terms of trade liberalization. The average bound tariff for agriculture, which is a 55%, is still double the average bound tariff for industrial goods, for example, not to mention that agricultural subsidies still remain high, even if the WTO has succeeded in reducing them. Now, the WTO Agreement on Agriculture is only part of what the WTO has done for agriculture. Other agreements have done a tremendous amount too. For example, rules on industrial products in the WTO and rules on services, as well as rules on intellectual property, have all contributed to global food security. Farmers need a lot more than food to trade in food. They need lots of industrial products like fertilizers, tractors, plows. They need services like weather monitoring services, banking services, retail services, and they need intellectual property rights to preserve the ideas that are now embodied in food. And as we know, our food is becoming much more sophisticated, for example, with biotech foods or with fortified foods and so on. Now, high-tech foods are the focus of today's debate, and they come to challenge, I believe, the perception both outside and to some extent inside the WTO that the only agreement in the WTO rulebook relevant to the sector of world trade is the Agreement on Agriculture. High-tech foods are built on ideas that must be rewarded through intellectual property rights, and are often built using much more sophisticated machinery than the average plow, such as 3D printers, artificial intelligence, equipment, and much more. The goal of today's dialogue is first to understand how the world of high-tech foods has been evolving, and second, to understand whether the trading system is successfully accompanying the evolution of food. With us today is a very distinguished panel to discuss this broad nexus of issues. So let me, without further ado, introduce our panelists to you. Her Excellency, Ms. Shir Slutsky, Deputy Permanent Representative to the WTO and Head of the Economic and Trade Mission of the Permanent Mission of Israel. Welcome. Maximilien Marcat, CEO and co-founder of Planet A Foods. Welcome. Phil Webster, Principal of Global Technology and Innovation Management Practice at Arthur D. Little. Welcome, Phil. And Nir Goldstein, Managing Director of the Good Food Institute, Israel. Apologies. With us today are also two WTO experts who will accompany this discussion as it proceeds. Gabrielle Marceau, who's one of the WTO's top lawyers, and she will be talking to us today about how the WTO rulebook hangs together as a whole when it comes to food. And Christian Wolf, who is the WTO's top expert on sanitary and phytosanitary measures, and therefore an expert on the regulatory frameworks that surround food. And she will be talking to us about those frameworks and their interaction with world trade. So let me, without further ado, start with the first round of questions. Your Excellency, Ms. Slutsky, let me start with you. It's an honor to have you with us. Thank you very much for being here. Israel is one of the most advanced countries in agriculture and water management. Where does Israel, in your opinion, see the future of agriculture as heading, and what are some of the innovations it has on the horizon to meet the many challenges that food systems face, i.e. those of feeding a growing world population and of doing so more sustainably?
Thank you, Doa. Good afternoon to our audience. I'm honored to take part in this trade dialogue on food tech on behalf of the State of Israel. So thank you. As you have mentioned, Doa, Israel is very advanced in water and agriculture technologies, and in recent years, also a world hub for food technologies, what we often call food tech. Israel has started to develop its innovation in agriculture about 100 years ago, even before the establishment of Israel, to address the existential need to achieve food and water security in an extremely challenging climate and soil conditions. Most of Israel's land is a desert, and we faced an acute water scarcity in the past. As we all know, necessity is the mother of invention. And in our case, it pushed Israel to develop new technologies and farming methods that enable farmers to grow more with less, despite the challenging conditions. Over the years, Israel developed expertise in water treatment, desalination, drip irrigation, greenhouses, plant science, and crop protection. Since the 2000s, the Israeli agri-food tech ecosystem has grown remarkably, building on Israel's traditional agricultural innovation, combined with its growing knowledge and reputation in high-tech. Today, it is home to a thriving ecosystem, the second largest in the world in terms of startups per capita. As the world's population grows and urbanizes, standard agricultural methods are not enough to supply it without depleting natural resources and causing severe environmental damage. Climate change has made agriculture even more difficult. In addition, the consumers demand not just more affordable, but also healthier food. People are becoming more conscious of the sustainability issues surrounding food production. Accordingly, the agriculture world is changing from equipment and inputs to technologies such as farm management, water desalination, waste treatment, supply chain management, and many more. There are many novel solutions, including IoT, Internet of Things, and robotic farms, dryland agriculture, water technology and wastewater reclamation, fertilization and integrated crop protection methods. There are also post-harvest treatments and shelf life extension technology. For example, an integration of sensors deployed throughout the fields and cloud-based software solutions enables data collection and analysis. It allows growers to optimize irrigation regimes, save water, and minimize fertilization while ensuring a healthy and robust harvest. In the sky, sophisticated drones and remote sensing satellites provide agricultural information on cultivated land, enabling quick identification of crop diseases. To face plant pollination challenges, automated pollination systems reduce the dependency on spontaneous insect-based pollination. Additionally, machine learning algorithms recruit nature to generate stronger and healthier hives. In food tech, 3D printing technology is being used to print beef, for example. There are many technologies that are being used in this field, such as precision fermentation, cultivated and plant-based products. Neil will elaborate on it later on. So to summarize, we see an amazing innovation being developed in Israel in these areas, what we call agri-food tech. And I personally believe that the world is going this direction. These technologies are not the only solution to the global food crisis, but they are an important part of it, especially due to the common understanding that the solutions should also be more sustainable and environmental friendly. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this. So robotic farms, integrated crop protection, sensors throughout the fields for data collection, quick identification of diseases, algorithms, 3D printing of food, extraordinary. Basically, the future of food is likely to be completely different from food as we know it today. So thank you very much for those remarks. I think it sets out the landscape very well for this dialogue. Maximilian, I'd like to come to you. Planet A Foods received much attention during COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh at the end of last year because of the environmental innovation it is trying to introduce. And in fact, that's how we heard about you, and that's why we extended the invitation to you today. Can you walk us through what Planet A Food does and how you see the future of food?
Yep, sure. Thanks for having me today. It's very exciting for me to be here in that round of people. My name is Max. I'm the CEO of Planet A Foods, and with Planet A Foods, we are trying to build the food ingredient champion of the future. So we're recreating known food ingredients that are responsible for either major deforestation or child slavery or biodiversity loss or huge water usage. And we are recreating those ingredients using fermentation processes. Main ingredients that we're currently tackling is A, cocoa, and B, palm oil. So what we are basically doing is we're developing a cocoa alternative and a palm oil alternative using, for example, using precision fermentation. Instead of kind of growing those ingredients in areas where you should have rainforest, we're using instead local ingredients, such as sugar molasses, a byproduct of the sugar industry, such as sunflower seeds, such as oats. And we're fermenting those oats, sunflower seeds, and sugar molasses using our proprietary process into palm oil, into cocoa butter, but also into cocoa powder. Talking about food ingredients, our first food ingredient that we're currently commercializing is actually chocolate that comes completely without cocoa. So instead of cocoa butter and cocoa powder, we use our fermented ingredients and create a product that is A, on the sensory level, but B, also on the functional level, behaving in the same way as conventional chocolate. So it tastes as delicious, but also works with the same machinery of our customers. We are selling our cocoa-free chocolate in the B2B business models to big corporations, such as Nestle, such as Mondelez, such as Mars. So those companies are targets for our new category of ingredients. What we can offer to them are ingredients that are completely resilient from a supply chain perspective, but that are also that have a very low CO2 footprint and no deforestation, no biodiversity loss attached to them. That's what we're currently doing. Talking about the future, I mean, in the past, we've seen a lot of technologies that enable animal-free food or animal-free, dairy-free, animal-free foods. I think the future or the next years will mainly bring new technologies to kind of decouple supply chains from limited resources, to decrease the load on our local ecosystems. And I see especially technologies coming up in the field of precision fermentation for proteins and fats. And yeah, I'm very excited to be part of that new era of foods.
Wow, thank you very much for that. Of course, what you do today already sounds pretty futuristic to me. So my question to you on the future of food sounds like the future. It sounds from your answer like the future has already arrived. So that's very exciting, and I'm sure we'll be learning more from you about this as we go on. So let me now turn to another very important innovator with us on this panel, Nir. Nir, let me come to you. You head the Good Food Institute of Israel, pushing plant-based and cultivated meat innovation in what is often called the startup nation, Israel. Can you walk us through what the Institute does and how you see the future of food and the future of proteins in particular in our food?
Hi, Doa. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. So the Good Food Institute, GFI, we are an international nonprofit think tank, and we work with multinationals like yourself, like the World Bank and others, governments and businesses and researchers in order to promote the field of alternative protein. And the questions come, why do we need food technology? Isn't it, just fancy food for rich countries? And the answer is that the main issue while humanity is growing, while we are reaching 9.7 billion people, is that consumption, the demand for meat globally is actually going to double by 2050. And as we know, factory farming presents huge challenges for the future of humanity. It is significantly inefficient. In order to get 1 calorie out of a cow, the cow needs to eat more than 40 calories. And right now, humanity uses over 70% of our agricultural land and fresh water to make meat using animals. And nowadays, we also know that in terms of climate, more than 20%, a fifth of the global greenhouse gas emissions come from the way we make meat using factory farming. Going into trade issues, we know that the way we currently supply meat globally is very fragile and complicated. Israel, for example, is a small island country. We import more than 80% of our meat, and this is very not resilient in the difficult times that we are experiencing nowadays. And the last challenge is also a big one in terms of safety. We know that over 70% of antibiotics globally are used not for humans, but for animals, the animals that we grow in order to eat them, and this drives antimicrobial resistance. So we know that we have huge challenges, but yet the humanity is going to consume double the amount of meat it currently eats. What are we going to do about it? Well, this is where technology kicks in. What we need to do is to create meat and fish and chicken and dairy and eggs, but make them from plants, make them from cells. And in fact, we have no way to overcome the climate challenge without doing so. So this technological field of food tech and alternative protein has had a very successful couple of years. We are talking about more than $20 billion invested globally in this field across 3 technologies. One is plant-based that we all probably know. We are talking about meat made from plants, such companies like Beyond Meat and Impossible Burgers, and those products are already on the market. But we also have some more innovative technologies like fermentation, which Max mentioned earlier. We can now actually, in some countries, drink cow milk that was not made by a cow, but was made from yeast. And similarly, we can also consume cultivated meat, which is meat, real meat, made from cells. without harming animals. We can now consume those types of products in Singapore. Earlier this year, the FDA in the United States also gave a green light for the first product, and hopefully we will be able to eat those products worldwide soon. And in terms of the Israeli leadership, I'll conclude with that. Israel is currently the world's leading hub for alternative protein innovation. We are happy to have to hold the number 2 position in terms of investments annually in the last 3 years in the field. We are also happy to host the world's first 2 academic research centers dedicated to the field. Yeah, I hope this answers.
Indeed, it does. And it shows the extent of the innovation in the area of proteins and the meat sector. And of course, you've set out the case for why we need to be looking perhaps beyond meat and for alternatives. So thank you very much for that. Phil, let me come to you. You've heard the previous 2 speakers. As the principal of global technology and innovation management practice of Arthur D. Little, you're an expert on what it takes to innovate. What will further innovation in the food sector look like in your view, and what are your predictions for the future of food?
Sure, and thank you for having me here, and some great points raised already, some of which I'll just build on slightly. I mean, in my view, the future of innovation in the food sector is taking place in a world of uncertainty, greater convergence, and disruption. And if I talk about uncertainty first, there are a range of external pressures faced today in terms of the rising costs of food production, the scarcity of some raw materials, the disruption of supply, which is having an impact on the resilience of global supply chains. And as well as the imbalances in how food is being produced and distributed around the world, this means that we're seeing more recent effects around the greater localization of production, increasing regionalization of supply chains, and a desire to simplify recipes for some consumer packaged goods, many of which contain large numbers of ingredients from many different countries. Simultaneously, there's an increasing level of convergence between different parts of the value chain from farm to fork, and also with other industries such as pharmaceuticals, logistics, and even kitchen automation. This is especially in areas such as food products that are able to make a health claim, for example, or at the very least being badged as clean label, containing natural ingredients, or even making a functional health claim, such as some spreads and margarines, which contains things like plant stenols that can be claimed to reduce cholesterol. This can be very difficult to achieve, though, and our own research has found that some 80% of new food products with health benefits are withdrawn within 2 years of launch. So it's a very difficult thing to do. Thirdly, disruption. So larger consumer packaged goods companies have for quite a while now faced disruption from smaller and more nimbler businesses with novel ideas, novel products, and the ability to develop novel ingredients, who are able to get products to market much faster. And we've learned, for example, that over the last few years, less than 10% of genuinely new products are now being launched by new CPG companies. So a world of disruption, a world of uncertainty, a world of convergence. Now, against this backdrop, consumer delight is also paramount. So consumers now desire more sophisticated asks. They expect healthier products with fewer additives, more clean label, more plant-based, and in some cases more tailored to their own dietary requirements. They have a greater understanding of what they eat and where it comes from, and there is a baseline expectation that products are both sustainable and traceable and good for the environment as well as for you. And this means that companies have set themselves some quite ambitious sustainability targets in response to consumer, regulatory, and stakeholder pressures. But despite this, the environmental footprint for food is still enormous. So, for example, 21% of the fresh water that's used to grow our food is wasted because of the magnitude of food thrown away as post-consumer waste each year. So far I've painted a picture of uncertainty, convergence, disruption, and for me, one of the main enablers to overcome these issues is the advancement of science and technology. And we're now seeing the widespread emergence of high-tech or novel foods. Advances in industrial biotechnology, for example, have enabled the widespread production of lab-grown meat, as we just heard. Vegetarian and plant-based alternatives to alternative animal proteins are now becoming increasingly widespread also. And some of our work with the large FMCG companies has found that some of the highest market potential is indeed in lipids and proteins and biotics, which are growing rapidly, followed by flavors and fragrances and vitamins, which can be developed through novel routes. And we've seen some examples of very high value flavors and fragrances being produced through fermentation routes, such as alternatives to natural vanillin, nuke ketones that taste like grapefruit, benzaldehydes that taste like cherry. Not only do we have novel ingredients, but we also have novel approaches for producing these ingredients, which are becoming widespread today. So if I take something that already exists on the market, we've got omega-3 fatty acids, good dietary supplement, traditionally harvested from sometimes unsustainable sources of fish oil, like anchoveta in Peru, for example. These can now be produced as the result of novel fermentation processes grown in bioreactors, thus offsetting some of the environmental issues. And one of the main challenges that these organisations face, and indeed which companies like Planet A Foods, who are with us today, have successfully overcome, is ensuring that these products continue to need to taste nice, so people actually want to eat them. So back to my point that, you know, consumer delight is critical to maintain throughout. So then, what does the future of innovation of food look like in a world where businesses face greater uncertainty, disruption, and convergence? I've got three takeaways. One is that they will need to partner with organisations from industries that they may never have worked with to build new capabilities. And this is especially important in novel ingredients, where traditional food and beverage companies may need to work with external providers and experts in biotechnology and fermentation to build new capability. And we're seeing organisations such as Biobase Europe in Belgium and the Centre for Process Innovation in the UK becoming expert partners in these spaces. Secondly, they need to revolutionise their supply chains in order to enable the sourcing of new ingredients. And in my opinion, in some areas, this could eventually result in the wholesale substitution of commodities which exist in supply chains which have a higher risk of disruption or where prices can fluctuate. And thirdly, they need to be ready to engage with regulators and work proactively with agencies such as the WTO as new inventions come to the fore to ensure that some of these brand new regulations needed are effective, fit for purpose, and ensure that products continue to be safe, legal, sustainable, and of high quality, and that consumers continue to be delighted. Hope that answers the question. Thank you.
It does indeed. And let me just ask you a quick follow-up question. Did you say that 80% of new foods are typically withdrawn, or did I misunderstand? Yeah, so this is, if you look at new foods that are produced, which have sort of health claims associated with them. So, you know, and the definition of health claim can vary very widely, but quite a lot of them either get challenged or withdrawn after they've been launched, so they don't stick around on the market for very long. And if you just sort of, you know, scroll through some of the trade press and so forth, there's a lot of things that then get sort of challenged retrospectively as well. So it can be very difficult to make the link between health and wellness and prove it in a way that satisfies those who are there to safeguard us against any fraudulent claims. So it's a very tricky thing to do. Excellent. Thank you very much. And of course, that's, you know, a big issue from a world trade perspective. And I'm sure we'll be coming to the issue of claims and labels and all of that as this webinar proceeds. So that was wonderful, Phil. Thank you very much. Gabrielle, let me come to you. You've now heard from the many experts on this panel. So can you walk us through how the WTO rulebook as a whole supports trade in new and innovative foods, also giving us a flavor of environmental sustainability discussions in WTO. Of course, we have Christiane with us, who will be covering the regulatory aspects of the WTO rulebook, so you can leave those aspects to her.
Thank you, Dua, and thank you for inviting me to join this amazing panel. In a few minutes, I'll talk about the WTO rules, because WTO is, yes, a set of rules, but it's also, and it's important for this new food sort of approach. It's also a forum where government discuss their problems, where government can sue each other. And this forum of governance is one aspect that is becoming more and more important. But look at the rules as a whole. The goal of the WTO rules is to favor exchanges between countries, to favor trade between countries, and to avoid that countries block trade on the basis of origin or any sort of illegitimate discrimination. In fact, we say the goal of the WTO rules is to avoid protectionism and to favor the sort of new issues that we've heard about. Because if trade has increased, it's because government and their companies, of course, have innovated and created new ways of trading and including new food. Innovation is especially sort of favored and encouraged because the intellectual property treaties that existed before the WTO were more or less integrated into the WTO, such as, for instance, patent and other rules favoring inventions. There are also in the WTO a series of rules calculating the value of products, some rules on subsidies, limiting bad subsidies, trying to encourage subsidies. There are also rules in the context of favoring these exchanges about transit to avoid that food is blocked at the border or elsewhere for disguised reasons. And in the context of all these rules that favor the movement of products and services and agriculture products in particular, the WTO also has specific rules allowing governments, because the WTO is a forum for governments who will talk often about the problems of their companies, but there are special rules allowing governments to favor environmental concern, health concerns, or other exceptions, religion, or other concerns such as animal welfare. So this is why what we heard is very relevant about the WTO, because this new food in part is created due to food security problem, animal welfare concern. We heard about child labor, climate, etc. The WTO, another fundamental aspect in all this novelty, is the concern for developing countries, because although novelty is favored, the concern for taking care of developing countries who may take a bit more time to jump into this new sort of process has rules on transfer of technology, for instance, and other flexibilities to help them join the wagon. Now, 3 words on sustainable development, because this is crucial. It is often at the basis of this new IT food, but it is now part of the WTO preamble, and sustainable development is a goal of the WTO in itself and has been recognized many, many times in disputes. That is the right of governments to take care of their people, their animal, their plants in the best way possible. And in the context of sustainability, in addition to this principle that informs all WTO provisions, we have now at least 3 subgroups in addition to the Committee on Trade and Environment that deals with what is called structured discussions on sustainability. There's also some on plastic, on fossil fuel, but on sustainability, everything is discussed with everyone. It's not the traditional government-only forum. Private sector is involved, IGOs, individual experts and all that, to try to think of new ways to deal with all our problems. And last week, for instance, we had even a panel on water, trade and water. Water was already addressed in the Ag Agreement, which was a revolution. It is relevant for services, of course, as mentioned, because if we really want to favor the movement of products, the exchange of service, we have to deal with all aspects of such movement. And the last word, Doa, about what I said on the WTO as a governance forum, where there are committees on agriculture, on environment, but all these new sustainability issues where governments are encouraged to raise questions, other governments are asked to answer, to clarify and improve transparency. which is fundamental to governments and the world to find solutions to all these new problems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabrielle. And as usual, you succeed in making the WTO very accessible. So the WTO rulebook is very complex, but Gabrielle manages to distill the essentials for everyone. Christiane, I'd now like to come to you. Can you give our viewers an understanding of the role that the WTO plays on food regulations? The WTO, of course, is not a standard-setting body. So what then does it do with respect to food regulations? Please feel free to go beyond the agreement on sanitary and phytosanitary measures and also into the agreement on technical barriers to trade.
Yes, thank you, Doa. As you said, the WTO does not set any food standards, but its agreements provide a framework for governments that guides them in setting their national food regulations. Both the SPS and TBT agreements contain rules for national regulatory activities. The TBT agreement covers technical regulations, standards, and conformity assessment procedures that are used to check whether products actually comply with the technical requirements and with the standards. And under the TBT agreement, regulations must be necessary to obtain a legitimate regulatory objective. For example, they must be necessary for health protection or to prevent deceptive practices or for environmental protection. The SPS agreement covers regulations in particular areas, the area of food safety, animal and plant health. And these regulations taken with these objectives must be necessary to ensure the safety of the traded products. So they should not go beyond what is necessary, in other words. Neither of these two agreements allows discrimination between products coming from different countries or between imported and locally produced products. One question that may arise in this context is the question of what we call like products. For example, under the TBT agreement, regulations must not discriminate between like products that are coming from different origins. And one key question is whether, for example, high-tech foods might be considered like products, like their conventional older counterparts. So, for example, is chocolate without cocoa like old-fashioned chocolate? And what about plant-based meat products or cultured meat? So a lot of open questions. The SPS agreement requires all food safety regulations to be based on science. So any regulations on high-tech foods would also need to be based on scientific evidence. Some members may put in place temporary restrictions until such time that sufficient scientific evidence is available that allows them to do a full safety assessment of a new product. And approval procedures that are put in place, for example, for new products or new technologies to ensure their safety before they can be put on the market, those must be completed without undue delay. According to WTO rules, they must not be more burdensome than is necessary, for example, in terms of the information that is required to obtain approval. And they should be predictable and not become a trade barrier in and of itself. Since complying with different import requirements in each export market can also be quite costly and burdensome for exporters, both the SPS and the TBT agreement also strongly encourage WTO members to harmonize their SPS and TBT requirements, and in particular to base their national measures on international standards. And under the SPS agreement, there are particular standard-setting bodies in the area of food safety. It's the Codex Alimentarius Commission that are recognized. On the TBT side, there are no particular bodies identified. So, for example, to the extent that Codex develops standards for high-tech or for new types of technologies, foods produced in novel ways, this would help governments set national requirements to ensure the safety of these products, while at the same time also simultaneously facilitating trade. Thanks, Doa.
Extremely interesting, Christiane, and very thought-provoking. Indeed, the WTO tries to balance easing the flow of international trade, of easing the flow of foods, including novel foods, with all the regulatory goals that governments have. Governments want to make sure that new foods are safe. They want to make sure that the claims that are made on new foods are not deceptive, provide useful information to consumers, and so on. And then, of course, there's the very complex issue of like products that you raised, Christian, and that goes to issues like whether the same tariff will continue to apply to those novel foods, because are they different from what Christian rightly called their older counterparts? So some very complex issues. Thank you for that. I'll now move to the second round of questions. Your Excellency, Ms. Slutsky, I'd like to come back to you. And I'd like to turn to the WTO system and to explore Israel's perspective on whether Israel believes that the WTO is well equipped to meet the challenge of accompanying high-tech foods. Is the WTO fit for purpose in that respect? And what must it do better to accompany the future of food?
Thank you, Doa. Let me start first by saying that generally we think the new technologies in almost every sector require review at WTO regarding their compatibility with the multilateral trading rules. We saw it before, for example, before the creation of the ITA, the Information Technology Agreement. We see the acceleration in discussions on AI, artificial intelligence. Agri-food technologies require as well an overlook and maybe some adaptation. I can think of a few questions we might want to further discuss at the WTO in this respect. And you, Doa, and also Christian, before you've raised a few of these questions. And again, these are open questions, so I don't have all the answers, but I think we should start this discussion. So first, is the WTO and its members ready for trade, for example, in meat produced in a laboratory? This is a discussion that we believe that we should start now to determine which part of the rulebook is flexible enough to accommodate this trade, which part do we need to update, or perhaps just determine amongst ourselves how to approach the changes coming with the rules in place. We can follow the example of the Food and Agriculture Organization and the WHO, who in October last year added an agenda item to the Codex Alimentarius Commission session on the topic of new foods production systems, which they defined broadly to include cell culture-based food products, plant-based protein alternatives, and 3D printed foods. Another question can be, how do members shape their SPS measures when it comes to food tech products? For example, cultivated meat made of real animal cells does not require antibiotics during any stage of production. This meat is also not exposed to disease. The question would be, would members treat the cultivated meat the same as they treat the farmed meat, the traditional meat? And Christian, you asked this question, and this is an important one. Another question is, how will members ensure there is no duplicity in what is cultured meat versus farmed meat? This brings us to the TBT agreement regarding labeling. What will producers be allowed to call their products? Food tech challenges the very definition of different foodstuffs, and whether a food is included or excluded from the definition can have a significant impact and become an unfair barrier. How about their customs classifications? Will members be willing to treat these products differently at the borders? And Doa, I think you referred to this question. In addition, I wonder, many of these technologies are sustainable and environmental friendly. Will they be included, for example, under a possible future EGA, Environmental Goods Agreement? And this is the question also that we should also raise. Then, of course, we have the issue of being able to bring these products to market in the first place without members using the fact that they are novel foods to protect their own industry. Another aspect is IP rights. Innovations in food production, cultured meat, cellular agriculture, plant-based meats and agricultural technologies are changing the way that we source and consume food. To capitalize on this, companies need to secure an exclusive product or service niche, as well as demonstrate to potential licensees, investors, or buyers that their product or service has potential. Having the right intellectual property protection in place is key to the success of bringing any of these products to the market. Lastly, agri-food tech products are facing today regulatory barriers in many countries. This is an important role of all of us here at WTO and also in other organizations to respond to these new global developments and facilitate the trade in these products. Let me conclude by saying that we need more dialogue, like the dialogue we have today, and I'm happy to start this dialogue. We need it in order to address these challenges. There are many of them, and sooner or later we will have to discuss more in depth. Thank you.
I think you have set out an excellent menu of issues for us to consider. Lots of food for thought, so to speak, in what you've mentioned. Clearly, we are talking about a category of products that has such different features to traditional foods that we need not a non-traditional response within WTO rules as well. And sooner or later, we're going to have to come to the very wide set of issues that you've raised, so that the WTO's approach to these foods is modernized. Thank you very much for that. Maximilian, I'd like to come back to you. Now, environmental sustainability is, of course, a paramount food system concern going forward. But what would you say to developing countries that depend on commodities such as cocoa or palm oil for vital export revenue? What opportunities do you see for them in this new landscape?
I mean, this is not a question that is new to us, right? I hear that question quite often, and it's a fair question to ask. For me, today it's difficult to give a general answer over different commodities. So for the sake of time, I will focus on cocoa mainly in my answer, if I may. And for cocoa, how I see it, our product is not meant to replace cocoa per se. I think in the future there will be kind of conventional chocolates and chocolates made with our cocoa substitute. Both of them will coexist. And eventually our cocoa replacer or chocolate replacement will be rather used for mass market applications, while as traditional cocoa and traditional chocolate will rather be used for more premium applications. Let's look at the cocoa supply chain. In case of cocoa, we're talking about around 5 million tons of cocoa that are harvested worldwide every year. 5 million tons. 67% of those 5 million tons is coming from two countries, Ghana and Ivory Coast. On the other hand, I mean, this is the supply side. On the other hand, if we look at the consumption side, the cocoa consumption, the chocolate consumption is drastically going up since years. And especially it's going up, it's rising in emerging countries where people are getting wealthier and wealthier, and by that consume more and more chocolate. So especially we see big growth rates in India, in China, in those countries. Hence, more and more people are able to buy and consume chocolate. While as the kind of chocolate supply or cocoa supply that is detrimental for chocolate is like staying constant or even declining. Because what we see is that in the future, it will be more difficult to grow cocoa because climate change is definitely going to hit, especially the countries Ghana and Ivory Coast, and all those countries around the equator. And B, a lot of farmers are transitioning out of cocoa into other crops because they realize that their kind of agroforestry systems that they were using in the last 30 years are getting old and not efficient enough, and they're seeing that cocoa doesn't give them the returns that they want. So a lot of them actually are going away from cocoa anyway. So what we see is that an evolving gap between kind of the cocoa supply and the cocoa demand. And how I see it is that our product will, especially in the next 5 to 10 years, will close that gap. let's focus on kind of cocoa per se and why it will be more difficult to grow it. You know, growing cocoa needs a lot of water and a lot of humidity. And that's why cocoa is naturally grown in countries next to the equator. Now, if we look at climate change and if we look at the 1.5 degrees of global warming, it will unfortunately most likely come, especially in those countries where we have humidity now. The water and humidity will go down drastically, and that will lead to up to 50% of the kind of harvestable areas for cocoa will diminish in the next years. And a lot of scientists are predicting this, and we're already seeing it in the predictions for next year regarding adverse weather conditions, like dry times and reduction of harvests. On the other hand, a lot of those agroforestry systems are very old now. I mentioned it in the before. A lot of those farmers are using trees that are 20 years or older than 20 years. And normally a cocoa tree is just fertile for 25 years. So a lot of those farmers are kind of coming towards the end of the efficiency period of their trees in their agroforestry system. So this is also a big challenge for them. And three, a lot of diseases are threatening the cocoa plant. The cocoa plant is perceived one of the most threatened plants on the planet if you talk about diseases such as witch's broom or other pests. So the future of cocoa as it is now and the future of the cocoa supply chain as it is now is quite uncertain. And with the rising consumption of chocolate and cocoa in the world, especially in emerging countries, we will see some supply chain risks related to this. And we with Blade A Foods are going to close that gap. What does it bring for the countries? I mean, it doesn't help the countries. It's a very unfortunate situation for countries like Ghana and Ivory Coast, for sure. I'm aware of this. But eventually what I hope is that our product will be used in mass market applications, and eventually we can, by that, help traditional cocoa to be used for more premium applications, and by that eventually experience also rise in prices. So eventually we can help to premiumize normal cocoa, and by that help the people in those countries. But for sure the future is quite uncertain.
Thank you very much, and a very clear set of arguments here for the need to search for not alternatives, as you said, but other products that could coexist with traditional cocoa and traditional chocolate. Nir, let me come to you. What type of innovation in trade rule making and in trade rules would you want the WTO to deliver to accompany the protein transition that you've described to us earlier? How can the multilateral trading system help, in your view?
Thank you, Doa. I think it's a great question. And oftentimes when the changes in food security are being mentioned, we also look at what is happening in the water or energy security sectors to look for benchmark. And I think it's important to mention that while there's generally a limited number of ways humanity can generate or transfer or consume water and energy, food is very different. Especially when it comes to trade and trade rules. It's much more diverse, much more fragile, much more complicated in general. And so you are the trade rule experts. I can perhaps share my view of the challenges from the industry's point of view. And I think that when we are talking about the shift in the future of global food trade due to food technology, this is actually the first time, to be honest, today's discussion that I've heard this question being raised. It has not been raised enough. It has not been studied enough. And I think it's a complicated question. I think that change is coming either because of the increasing rate and magnitude of disruptions that the global food supply chain is experiencing, and also because of the technological adaptations that are expected to come in the coming years and decades. So I agree with the recommendation of Her Excellency with regards to now being a great time to generate research. And I think that what we need are proactive rule makers. Some of the challenges that the industry has are with regards to knowledge and speed and clarity and standardization. So, for example, when it comes to knowledge, I don't think we know yet what are the global food and food tech trade threats and opportunities. We have globally nowadays, due to the supply disruptions that happened after the Suez Canal issue and the war in Europe and the pandemic, we have a lot of countries across the world nowadays working on updating their food and more specifically food security strategies. We see a growing interest on the national level in focusing on diversifying import channels or increasing local manufacturing or increasing the emergency storage abilities. So we need to look at how those trends impact the global food trade and trade rules. And I think that we need speed because we need to have those great products come to market in terms of sustainability, in terms of food security. But the future of the food supply chain is being shaped as we speak. History is in the making, and it's being made a lot of time due to or in accordance with food regulation and food trade regulation. Many companies are choosing where to open their first factories with regards to where they can manufacture or sell their foods or transfer. For example, we have an Israeli company opening their first manufacturing factory in Denmark, but planning to sell it in the US. And both decisions have been made due to food and novel food regulations. So I think that what we need now is speed with regards to clarity. We need to know how and where to build the future industry, and we need standardization, not only with regards to novel food. And this is a global food tech arms race, so to speak. We are seeing the developed countries like Singapore, like Israel, like the United States, developing novel regulations, but we want those products also to go globally to the developing countries to make sure that no one is left behind. How can we make sure that the global South have accessibility to those products in terms of the regulations that allow it? Because currently regulation is actually a competitive edge for some countries. And the same is true for packaging and labeling. We have some questions with regards to, can we call a plant-based steak a steak in certain countries? This differs from country to country due to different reasons. Some of them are safety issues, some of them are political, some of them are economical. But again, history is in the making, and the decisions that will be made or not made now will shape the future of the industry. And I think, again, as an action item from today's discussion, we need to get at a very significant, a very serious research with regards to the issues that you just raised.
What a fantastic answer, Nir. Thank you very much for that. Clearly, industry wants knowledge, speed, and clarity. And you're right, of course, that we're in a very particular historical context because of COVID, war, global supply chain disruptions, a context where food security strategies are being revisited across the globe. But I found particularly thought-provoking your comment that regulation often drives change, that businesses do, they operate within the realm of what is possible because they want to sell. And so we need to be careful with that because we want novel foods to sometimes be the ones to drive regulation. We want new things that can come to the market and can challenge, some of the older and sort of more stabilized frameworks that are there, because we have new issues that we need to deal with, like sustainability and so on. So thank you very much for that. Phil, I'd like to come back to you. As innovation in food continues to go forward, what types of regulatory hurdles do you foresee? And what are the new types of regulatory frameworks that may be required in your view?
So there I'd just build effectively on what you just said around knowledge, speed and clarity. So those would be the sort of principles for what sort of things are needed there. Just to deepen that slightly, the sorts of issues that face some of the CPG companies that we work with on food and beverage innovation are, when we come to novel and high-tech foods, we're on new ground. And in some areas we're seeing levels of regulatory fragmentation and sometimes protectionism in certain cases, and a misstep or a change in the way in which things like phytosanitary or trade compliance is then managed can potentially, for some organisations, shut down a whole supply chain. So it's of great importance, and it's on the minds of many organisations today. And then in terms of what's needed, are sort of a few general principles around consistency and also certainty in terms of what direction regulations and legislation is going. The ability to demonstrate sustainability and transparency in a kind of consistent way. And then in terms of and then translating that into what that means for things like environmental sustainability claims and labelling, and whether these claims are mandatory or voluntary, and how to go about processing those in different places. We talked earlier about rewards for innovators. So, how do you sort of reward those that are trying to shape the future sustainable food landscape of tomorrow? And I'll probably just add to that around the importance of being able to manage data and information consistently in terms of how all this is communicated more broadly with the organisations that have influence or interest in the way these regulations unfold. So the sharing of knowledge and information and how data is then expected to be handled in an increasingly digitally enabled world. And I suppose just to conclude, what would make that effective is to have businesses and NGOs and research institutes and other organisations working in hand with regulators. And that will involve, businesses which are smaller as well as some of the big household names, but also those who are adjacent to the conventional food industry, as we see things like the healthcare, the nutrition, the pharmaceuticals and life sciences and biotech capabilities converging more with the food industry. So it's I suppose what we're seeing is a wider set of stakeholders that might otherwise not have been traditionally engaged with in the past.
Very interesting indeed. Thank you, Phil. Yes, regulatory fragmentation is a problem, and we certainly need consistency and certainty. Christian, let me come back to you. Can you give us a sense of some of the discussions that have been held in the WTO Committee on Sanitary and Phytosanitary Measures on new types of food? To our viewers, all of the WTO's 164 member governments sit on that committee. So what are the kinds of trade issues, Christian, that such new foods tend to raise? And what about also the recently adopted SPS declaration at the WTO's 12th Ministerial Conference, which is entitled Responding to Modern SPS Challenges? Does that in any way get to new foods?
Yes, very good questions, Doa. So at the WTO, there are different levels at which the conversations about regulations or measures, as we call them, affecting new or high-tech foods could take place. To start, an important principle in both the SPS and the TBT agreements is transparency, and new SPS and TBT regulations must be notified when they're still at a draft stage before they're final. And that's so that interesting trading partners can have a chance to submit comments on the draft regulation before it is finalized and enters into force. So it's a chance to start a dialogue and hopefully to prevent trade friction, trade problems from happening before it's too late to do anything about it. Now, looking at where we are now with the types of high-tech products we heard about today, members have started notifying some new regulations on these, but I wouldn't say there's a flood of notifications so far. For example, already a couple of years ago, there were a couple of TBT notifications on labeling of meat products containing cultured animal cells or on cultured seafood cells, for example. And then if other members have submitted comments, they would just send them bilaterally to the notifying member. It was the United States in this case, and it's not a conversation involving the whole WTO membership. So we cannot really measure to what extent those discussions are already taking place. The next level in the conversation about a new regulation would be to raise it in one of the committees that we already heard a little bit about as a specific trade concern. So both in the SPS committee and in the Technical Barriers to Trade committee, we have a lot of these discussions on particular measures to particular sectors where exporters are facing some sort of trade barrier. So far, we have not had any specific trade concerns raised about the types of high-tech foods that we've been talking about today, and I think it's because it's early days. Now, looking at the past where similar discussions have taken place that we may be able to learn something from, there have been both committees, SPS and WT, a lot of conversations about novel foods. This was already quite a few years ago. And the concerns were a little bit different. This was concerns about products of biodiversity. So for example, fruit growing in the forests of Latin America that were actually not new in the countries where they were coming from, but they were being marketed to new countries, to new markets, to new export markets where they were new, and they had to go through approval procedures. These approval procedures were perceived by the exporters as going beyond what was necessary. These were known products, according to them. There was evidence from years of consumption that they were safe. So it was about what is reasonable to require to give approval to such new products, and how burdensome these procedures are, how long they take before the products can finally be marketed. Over the years, there have also been many different conversations about, for example, genetically modified foods or foods derived from products that are genetically modified, both about the first generation of such products many years ago and also about more recent products produced with gene editing techniques. And again, one focus of these conversations was about approval procedures for placing such products on the market, but also about labeling and also certification requirements. So some questions that were raised were about the scientific basis of any new requirements, both for approval, but also for labeling. Others questioned whether the regulations were put in place in such a way that they were more trade restrictive than was necessary to achieve their objective, or whether there had been unjustifiable delays in approvals. Since, for example, genetically modified food, that's often bulk commodities, time lags in approvals between different countries can lead to situations where even small quantities of not yet approved varieties that are mixed into a larger shipment can lead to a rejection of a whole shipment. So the cost of trying to keep these types of varieties apart can be huge, and that it can really have a big impact on trade. Regarding the high-tech foods we're discussing today, we've seen the first notifications, as I said, but not yet really, they haven't really been discussed in the committees. I think we can imagine, and a couple of the other speakers have alluded to this, that the discussions would focus on some similar topics as in similar situations in the past. For example, they could touch upon definitions and labeling, and that has already been the case in some of the discussions at national level. For example, plant-based meat products, can you call them meat on the packaging, or is that deceiving consumers? What do you call a veggie sausage or bacon if you cannot use the word sausage or bacon? How do you tell consumers what it is? And then what type of approvals will be required for cultured meats? What type of labeling? Will there be time lags in the approval for such products in different markets? So I think, yeah, the future is coming, but it's not quite yet there, at least not here at the WTO in terms of the discussions we're seeing. Now, to briefly touch upon the SPS declaration that was adopted last year at the ministerial conference, it has launched a work program where the SPS committee is looking at the impact of emerging challenges and new opportunities, as we call them, on the implementation of the agreement. And the range of challenges that has been identified is quite broad. It ranges from climate change, environmental, sustainability, biodiversity issues, to pest and disease pressures, persisting trade barriers. But one of the challenges and opportunities that has been mentioned in the declaration is the increased pace of innovation and tools and technologies, and whether the way the SPS agreement is being implemented is keeping up with that, or whether it's posing any new challenges. So in the discussion so far, we have not specifically gone into the details, but in some of the future discussions that we're planning now, the intention is to hear directly from producers about what challenges they're facing. So I think the types of discussions we had today are extremely relevant, and I'm hoping that some of our members will bring exciting producers, such as the ones that we've heard from today.
Thank you very much, Christiane, for this very thoughtful and well-organized response. I think you've given a very clear lay of the land on SPS and TBT issues. And of course, you started your comments by highlighting that the WTO is a forum where draft regulations get notified and there's an opportunity for comments. And I think you're right to have started your remarks with that, because it just shows how valuable the WTO can be if notifications are made on time and if comments are taken seriously for the interaction that needs to take place between countries on issues as complex as this. But I was also intrigued by your comment that sometimes new is new for where a product is going, but it's not new for the country that it's leaving and that it's departing from. So that will be another fascinating issue to deal with. Gabrielle, I'd now like to come to you. In addition to being a rulemaking body, the WTO settles commercial disputes between its members. Can you give us a sense of how dispute settlement works in the area of food and of disputes involving high-tech foods in particular, and how the WTO has brought scientific expertise into its dispute settlement process?
Thank you, Dua. Yes, a few words about the dispute process, but I'm happy that everybody raised the point that first dialogues are necessary before disputes are initiated. And this is one aspect of the WTO, it's multiple forum. And I talk about it again because various speakers raised the role of companies, not only as innovators, but their role in the whole process of regulating this. And the business community has greatly increased and improved with COVID, where the new DG, as soon as she arrived, called the main sort of a multinational in vaccine and recognized that to deal with the sort of problems we face now, you need more than governments. You need collaboration of all types, including with the private sector. Now, let me give you a few examples of disputes, but already some I've mentioned, and then 2 words of the principles and the process. Example of disputes in agriculture goods are multiple. So you could have, as it's been mentioned many times, an issue where one government says, I promise not to collect more than 30% tariff on that meat. If another new sort of meat arrives, meat grown with hormones, for instance, we had a dispute, meat grown in laboratories, will you as an importing state be entitled, or rather obliged, to not collect more than the 30% you promise on meat? And then, as Christiane said, a whole debate on what is meat, the definition. But this is not new to agriculture. In disputes, we have developed here this principle of evolutionary interpretation. So in domestic context, what is a family led to several disputes. Can you have family composed differently from mother, father, and children? Well, in food, it's the same. We had here a big dispute about access to gambling. And the issue came because internet did not exist when the commitments were made under the services agreement. And this is now everywhere internet. Can you compare a good delivered physically, a good delivered by post, by phone and by internet. And the answer of the WTO was there's a technological neutrality principle in services. Whether this will have an impact on food, my point is that the WTO is able, and I would say ready, for dealing with those new challenges that are normal societal sort of challenges. Disputes in SPS, there have been several. And before I explain about the way we proceed with expert, let me just mention that in WTO, it has one of the most, I would think, sophisticated dispute settlement system where a government simply raise its flag and say, this other government has put in place a law, a regulation, a tax, a subsidy that discriminate against my product. And this in itself is sufficient to initiate a dispute process. There's no need to have actual trade. I'm not saying that it's good, and governments are wise. Usually they wait and they discuss for many years before they initiate disputes. But dispute is facilitated in the sense that small and big countries are equally treated and can trigger this process with 3 arbitrators selected by the parties. Unless they cannot agree, then the DG will nominate expert. These 3 arbitrators will decide whether or not the claims made that these 2 products are not like, or they are like, or this coming product, meat or otherwise, is dangerous. I worry it's grown in lab. I worry it says it's meat, but rather it is made of plant. Is it honest? Is it properly sort of labeled, etc.? So a claim is initiated, and then the 3 arbitrators will hear both sides. And the principle is that the claim and the alleged justification require the same sort of investment by the arbitrators, trying to see whether there is justification for a claim of violation. Now, in disputes where science is relevant, and it's the case for SPS, for TBT, for new food, I'm sure there will be scientific claims or counter-arguments. The system of the WTO dispute envisaged the right and sometimes even the obligation for the 3 judges, the 3 arbitrators, to hire experts, scientific expert in the case of food, but we've had situation where expert in translations were hired because it was an issue about whether or not a law in Japan discriminated. There was a battle on the meaning of terms. So SPS expert, environment expert can be hired for each problem. They can be, depending, 1 to 10 expert that will be there to help the panel understand the problems. They will be there to respond to questions from the panel and to questions from the parties. And at the end, the 3 arbitrators will reach a conclusion whether or not there is violation, whether the goods are like, for instance, because it was mentioned, but on subsidies, for instance, we know that in agriculture, domestic support subsidies are possible if they are written in your schedule. As a government, if you're allowed to give X amount of subsidy for X product, does this include new subsidies for these new products? So all these questions can be handled in disputes and are handled between governments. Of course, another principle of WTO early on put in place in the banana disputes was that it's for each government to decide who comes to dispute with them. They can bring their industry, they can bring academics, experts, but legally the dispute is between 2 countries. But as it was very, very well explained by 3 of the speakers, you cannot disconnect a government from the enterprise, because enterprise and business make decisions on the basis of regulations, will influence regulation, and it's all interlinked. And very, very often government initiate disputes because their business asks them to initiate a dispute for a question of principle that may not be relevant today, that will become relevant later. And this we've seen a lot in disputes where one government sues the other one, and there's relatively little trade between the 2 on that product, but they make it as a battle of principle. Thank you.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you very much. Gives us an excellent overview of how the WTO indeed incorporates science in the process of dispute settlement. We now have 10 minutes left and we have lots of questions from viewers. I'm going to field one question to each of you and ask you to please answer as quickly as you can. I'll start with Your Excellency, Ms. Slutsky. I have a question from a viewer who is asking whether WTO agriculture negotiations ought to go sectoral. Should we have a sectoral approach to these negotiations to speed them up? For example, a sectoral agreement on novel foods?
I'm not sure that we need necessarily need a sectoral agreement. No, I think that agriculture should be looked at as an holistic subject. So not a sectorial agreement, but maybe sectoral discussions that can be, I think, very efficient and very effective.
Thank you. Nir, I'd like to come to you. A question from a viewer who is saying replacing, as you mentioned, meat, fish, etc., with plant-based foods would that not increase the pressure on land and water if we need to grow more plants? So we will be reducing greenhouse gas emission from livestock, but putting pressure on the environment in other ways.
Thank you. Absolutely not. We are feeding cows nowadays, as I mentioned, 40 calories. We need to grow those calories. We are growing them from plants. If we eat the plants directly, we save over 90%. So that's an easy one. But even if we go to the more, let's say, complicated technologies, such as cultivated meat, for example, those are still much more efficient, especially if we rely on green energy and renewables. We can save between 90 to 30% in terms of all of the different incomes, such as land, water, antibiotics, of course, and also the feed part of it, which is reliant on plants. So much to save here.
Thank you, Nir. Max, a question to you from a viewer. In the chocolate that you are producing without cocoa, a viewer is asking whether using a life cycle analysis approach, you are still making a contribution to the environment, i.e., are you looking at the entire life cycle analysis of these novel foods?
In fact, we do. We work with technology to assess the life cycle of our products, and we're using, in our case, we decided to use a software from a company called Carbon Cloud in Sweden. So what we did is we visualized and digitized the whole supply chain from the crop, so from the field to the final product at destination of our customers. So all the logistics. So even if a truck uses diesel to transport one of our crops into our plant, this is like accounted in our model. So we have the full analysis from field to customer in a way, and are completely transparent there. And everyone can look at it on carboncloud.com.
Thank you. Phil, a question to you. How much risk do novel ingredients pose? And what have you seen so far?
I suppose that would depend on whether the novel ingredient is sort of simply a direct substitute for something which already exists, or whether it is something that's more kind of completely new to world. But I think when it comes to actually finding these novel ingredients being sort of produced and launched and so forth, by the time they actually reach consumers, they would have been very heavily de-risked. So a huge amount of attention goes into ensuring that these new ingredients are safe, legal, fit for human or for pet consumption, that things like, you know, the interactions between the food and the packaging in which they're residing are thought through as well. There's a huge amount of effort that goes into that. So by the time they actually reach, you know, a consumer's fork, as it were, I would say that the risks would be extremely low.
Excellent. Christian, a question to you. A viewer is asking whether there is scope in the SPS agreement for the precautionary principle and whether it has been, whether it's ever been misused to slow the progress of innovation.
Thank you. Yeah, good question. We haven't talked about precaution so far. So the way that the idea of precaution or a precautionary approach comes into the SPS agreement is that it contains some special provisions for situations where scientific evidence is insufficient. So normally when a government puts in place a regulation, it should do so based on scientific evidence. But there are situations where something is so new, whether it's a new food product or maybe an emerging pest or disease, that there is no scientific evidence yet. And in such cases, what the SPS agreement foresees is that members would take a provisional measure. They would put in place a measure to protect health first. That clearly comes first. And they would do so based on the information that they do have. Some information might already be available. But this right to put in place a provisional measure comes with an obligation to try to find additional information as it becomes available, and then to review the provisional measure to see whether, for example, it was really justified to put in place a precautionary measure because there's a new emerging disease, or maybe on a new technology while it is still being studied, so while the risk assessment is being carried out. Whether this has ever slowed the emergence of new products, well, I think if you talk to the industry, they would say that the trade in genetically modified products or products derived from genetically modified technologies has been affected, certainly, by the differences in approvals in different countries. So different countries around the world have taken very different policies with respect to these. And that has certainly hasn't had an impact on trade and on the commercialization of these products.
Thank you, Christian. Gabrielle, also very, very quickly, a question from a viewer on subsidies. The viewer is asking about all the subsidies that are being poured today into innovation, in particular innovation that addresses climate change. Could it lead to a subsidy war at WTO?
Yes, of course. The fact that it's not yet fully properly regulated could lead to a subsidy war where both sides and all players abuse subsidy. That's why again and again dialogue is crucial, and this is the right place because subsidies are not discussed elsewhere. WTO is the forum to discuss that. Allow me just to add one small thing to what Christian said to support what she said, and it's a good example. Governments under WTO have the right to set the level of protection they want, even if it can look abusive to others. But just to give an example of a dispute, and it's relevant, a few years back, Australia banned importation of salmon because of a disease salmon from Canada and US. And the answer to Australia was, yes, you can ban fresh salmon if it has this disease, even if it's not transmissible. But why are you also importing lobster from the same water with the same disease? Are you really sure you you worry about the disease? Isn't it another reason? So this is a sort of dispute that could come to the WTO and that require discussions in advance. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this, and thank you very much to you all. We are perfectly on time. This has been an amazing discussion, incredibly enriching, and I'm sure many people will be studying everything you've said on this webinar. This webinar is recorded and stays on the WTO Trade Dialogues on Food website for future viewership. So a big thank you to each and every one of you for having dedicated the time, and we will certainly be in touch with the outside panelists here with whom we want to stay in contact and from whom we want to learn more. Thank you, and thank you, Your Excellency, for having made the time as well.
Thank you, Doa. Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.
Wonderful event.
Thanks, Doa.
Thank you.
Thank you
Goodbye.
all. Bye-bye.